Chilling tales for dark nights.
World's Best School Psychologist. Written by CreepyCarbs. Performed by Joseph Gable. When I was 12, I came to the conclusion that everyone in the world, including my own family, was against me. I was never a problem child, but my parents sure treated me like one. For example, I used to need to be home by 5 p.m. every day. This clearly restricted my amount of playtime outdoors. I wasn't allowed to have friends over to play at the house, nor was I allowed to go over anyone else's. I had to finish my homework directly after I came home from school, no matter how long it took. My parents refused to buy me video games and forced me to read books and then write a book report on them to prove I actually read it. Now, even though those rules listed above were quite frustrating to me as a child, they aren't what upset me the most. What really hurt me was the lack of compassion on behalf of my parents. My mother was a bitter woman who always made me feel guilty of accidents or mistakes I've made. My father only knew one emotion: frustration. The only time he spoke to me was when he screamed at me for receiving poor test scores or beat me for misbehaving. But enough about them. Let's talk about my school's psychologist. For his own privacy, we will call him Dr. Tanner. Like most junior high schools, a psychologist is always available on campus during school hours to assist any student in need of counseling, whether it is emotional, academic, social, behavioral, etc. To be honest, I have never seen any students talking with Dr. Tanner. Every day I would walk past his office on my way to the cafeteria and peek through his door's little window. He would always be alone in there, working on some paperwork. I guessed that most kids were too afraid to speak about their problems to an adult who was practically a stranger. For this reason, it took me 3 weeks to muster enough courage to go into his office. March 2nd, 1993. Was the day I decided to voice my troubles to Dr. Tanner. During lunch break, I stood in front of his office door and knocked. Through the window, I could see him raise his head, smile, and motion for me to come in. I did. He greeted me by introducing himself and asking for my name. Dr. Tanner was a very soft-spoken man who seemed to radiate kindness. In less than 30 minutes, I rambled to Dr. Tanner about how mean my parents were to me, and how they didn't care about me at all. After a while, my voice began to quiver, and I stopped speaking. The psychologist listened patiently to my whole spiel, arms folded and head nodding. I half expected him to begin talking about how everything I had just said was untrue, and that my parents loved me dearly, and blah blah blah. But he didn't. Dr. Tanner leaned towards me with a grin on his face and said,
"You know, I'm the best school psychologist in the world. I promise we'll fix this."
I rolled my eyes.
Okay, but how?
I have my ways. I'm a man of my word. I promise that within just 1 month, the relationship between you and your parents will change for the better. Forever. Although, I do need you to make me a promise. You have to promise me that you'll come back to my office after school tomorrow and that you won't tell anyone that we had this conversation today. It'll be our little secret.
I promised. The following day, I returned to Dr. Tanner after school. It was around 4 p.m. when I entered his office. After a warm welcome, he asked me to have a seat in front of his desk once again. Upon sitting down, I watched Dr. Tanner close the blinds of his door's tiny window.
There.
He smiled.
Now we have all the privacy we need.
We began to talk about my likes and interests, my favorite subjects in school, my least favorite teachers, and things of the like. About an hour into the conversation, Dr. Tanner offered me a soft drink. I gladly took the offer, considering my parents had never allowed me to drink soda. Dr. Tanner reached over to his mini-fridge and fidgeted around before setting down 2 open cans of soda on the desk. Afterwards, we continued to talk about what was going on in my life, but it wasn't long before I passed out from whatever drugs Dr. Tanner placed in my drink. It took me a minute or so to adjust my blurred vision upon waking, and when it did, I had no idea what to think. I was handcuffed to a bed, and my mouth was sealed with duct tape. I immediately began to panic, squirming and tugging at the cuffs, but gave up soon after. My eyes widened in disbelief after looking around the room. There were posters of superheroes pinned up along the walls and photographs of famous athletes on shelves. In the middle of the room was an old television and Super Nintendo, various game cartridges stacked alongside it. I didn't know what to think. Here I am in a room filled with items most kids would die to play with. I would have probably cried from joy hadn't I been handcuffed to a bed frame. My stomach sank once again as the door opened, and Dr. Tanner walked inside. He sat down on the edge of the bed.
Now listen. Remember that I'm here to help you, and I would never hurt you. Okay?
Dr. Tanner gently removed the tape from my mouth, and then the cuffs from my hands. My first instinct was to begin crying, but something about Dr. Tanner made me feel safe. He smiled at me.
You're going to be staying here for a while. And during this time, you're allowed to play with any toys in this room while I'm here at home. But when I leave the house, I'll need to cuff one of your hands back to the bed. Well, you can still watch the television, but I want you to only watch the news channels while I'm away.
I sat in silence, still trying to process the information he had given me.
So,
Dr. Tanner yipped, slapping me on the knee.
You go ahead, knock yourself out. I'll be back when it's time for dinner.
He got up from the bed, walked across the room, and clicked the TV's power button before locking the door behind him. Several more minutes passed before I realized that Dr. Tanner wasn't joking. All that was left for me to do was boot up the Nintendo and play Mario until nightfall. At about 7 p.m., Dr. Tanner returned to the room carrying 2 plates of mashed potatoes and chicken strips. I finally gathered up the courage to ask him how long I'd be staying in this room.
Well, about a month. Give or take a few weeks. I just have some work I need to do.
The following morning, I awoke to Dr. Tanner's hand patting my head.
Hey, bud. You don't have to wake up right now if you don't want, but I am going to need to put this back on,
he whispered, clamping the cold steel handcuff onto my wrist. I gazed up at him. He was wearing a collared shirt and slacks, a coat draped over his shoulder, and a suitcase at his side. He looked just how he always did when I saw him around school. Before leaving, he placed the TV's remote next to me and told me to turn it on and watch the news. The first thing I saw upon turning it on was a breaking news segment. An important-looking police officer stood at a podium surrounded by people with microphones. I happened to begin viewing halfway through his speech.
The statewide Amber Alert has been issued as of this morning. We have several investigators working towards identifying potential abductors, but as of right now, there is not much evidence. Faculty members state that the boy had been last seen around 4 or 5 in the evening.
I began to feel nauseous as a photograph of me appeared on the screen. It was my yearbook picture from last year. Captions for the photograph displayed my name and age, my school, and my town. Above my picture were alternating titles: FBI begins search for child, and Kidnapping suspect unknown, and Potential runaway. The live footage continued, and 2 figures I soon recognized as my mom and dad stepped up to the podium. Both appeared to have reddened eyes. Tears streamed down my mother's face as she took hold of a microphone. I'd never seen so much emotion come from my mother before as she wept on live television.
Please, return my baby back to me. I'm so sorry. Please, come home to us.
When my father took the microphone, I nearly expected his attitude to be stone cold, but he too had tears in his eyes. He pleaded to the world to bring his son home safely, and lastly begged for my forgiveness.
I know I haven't been the best father. I'm sorry. Excuse me.
I know I haven't been the best father, but God, I do wish I had been now. Please bring my boy back.
I turned the power off shortly after. My emotions were mixed, for I had never once seen my father cry. I felt miserable that my parents were being put through so much. But at the same time, I felt relief. I now know how much Mom and Dad love me. Nearly 4 weeks have passed, and Dr. Tanner has been treating me with the utmost respect. He leaves me in the morning, cuffed to the bed frame, but returns in the afternoon to eat lunch and dinner with me, talk, and play games. I never would have guessed how good Dr. Tanner was at Monopoly and Scrabble. But one morning when Dr. Tanner woke me before heading off to work, I noticed a stern look on his face. I also realized that it was 3 hours earlier than when he usually wakes me.
You need to watch the news today, no exceptions. I want you to keep the television on all day and pay close attention to it,
he stated grimly. I, of course, complied and watched him exit the room. About 2 hours later, a breaking news segment interrupted the toothpaste commercial I was watching. The title, Human Remnants Found. 2 staunch-looking men in suits stood beside one another and began speaking.
We are displeased to bring up such unfortunate news this morning regarding our missing child case from earlier this month.
One of the men bowed his head while the other one speaking shuffled through some papers. He continued.
The remains of a body have been found in a garbage bag beneath a highway overpass. The body appears to be that of a child, although not much of it is left. The body has been decapitated, and much has been burnt to ash and bone.
The screen shifted over to a helicopter view of the freeway. Dozens of police cars gathered near the bottom of a tall overpass. The man's voice could still be heard.
Within the bag, police found a junior high school identification card labeled as such.
The screen showed the school ID card I always kept in my backpack. The plastic was sort of melted away, but my photograph and name were intact. After the 2 men dismissed themselves, the camera panned over to my parents. They were sitting among reporters. My mother's face held a painful grimace, and my father sulked his head down at his knees. I shut the television off. Dr. Tanner returned home very late. He hurried into the room, unlocked my cuffs, and placed a bottle of fizzing water into my hand. He placed his hands onto my shoulders and smiled.
I made you a promise, didn't I?
I nodded, tears squeezing their way out my eyes.
You need to make me a promise again,
he whispered. He told me that I needed to drink all the water in the bottle. It would help me sleep, and that from here on, I am never to tell anyone that I ever met him. I promised.
I told you, I'm the best school psychologist in the world.
And he was right. I awoke later that night to find myself lying in the middle of a park, stars shining brilliantly across the night sky. I recognized the park. It wasn't too far from my school. A mile or so down the road, I saw my house. The lights were off inside, but I could make out my father sitting on the step leading to the front door. I hesitantly called out to him. He lifted his head slowly, but when he saw it was me, he sprang to his feet, ran towards me, arms open, yelling my name. My mother erupted from the house behind him. Dr. Tanner was right. Things have changed with my family and I. My parents smile more often and treat me lovingly. I could not ask for a more perfect ending. Every now and then, I see Dr. Tanner on campus, walking to and from his office. Rarely do we ever make eye contact, let alone speak to one another. But sometimes he'll shoot me a wink and a smile. I'll always keep my promise to him and pretend I never met him. But there will always be one question forever floating in my mind. Who did Dr. Tanner decapitate and throw off the overpass?
story to scare my son by R.D. Ovenfriend. Narration, original score, and sound design by Jesse Cornett, featuring Luke Fischer. Son, we need to have a chat about internet safety. I slowly crumpled down onto the floor next to him. His laptop was open and he was playing Minecraft on a public server. His eyes were locked into the action. Comments scrolled down the side of the screen in the chat box. Son, can you stop your game for a minute? He exited the world, closed the laptop, and looked up at me.
Dad, is this gonna be another cheesy, scary story?
What? I faked hurt feelings for a second, and then grinned at him. I thought you liked my cautionary tales. He grew up listening to my stories about children who encountered witches, ghosts, werewolves, and trolls. Like many generations of parents, I use scary stories to reinforce morals and teach lessons about safety. Single dads like me should use all the parenting tools at their disposal. He scrunched his face a little.
They were fine when I was 6, but now that I'm getting older, they don't scare me anymore. They seem kind of silly. If you're gonna tell a story about the internet, can you make it really, really scary?
I squinted at him incredulously. He folded his arms.
Dad, I'm 10. I can handle it.
Okay. I'll try. I began. Once upon a time, there was a boy named Colby. His expression indicated that he wasn't impressed with the terror of the introduction. He sighed deeply and settled in for one of Dad's cheesy stories. And I continued. Colby went online and joined several children's websites. After a while, he started talking to other kids in-game and on the message boards. He made friends with another 10-year-old boy named Helper23. They liked the same video games and shows. They laughed at each other's jokes. They explored new games together. After several months of friendship, Colby gave Helper23 6 diamonds in a game they were playing. And this was a very generous gift. Colby's birthday was coming up, and Helper23 wanted to send him a cool present in real life. Colby figured it wouldn't hurt to give Helper23 his home address, as long as he promised not to tell it to any strangers or grown-ups. Helper23 swore he wouldn't tell anyone else, not even his own parents, and set about mailing the package. I paused the story and asked my son, "Do you think that was a good idea?"
No,
he said, shaking his head vigorously. In spite of himself, he was getting into the story. Well, neither did Colby. Colby felt guilty about giving away his home address, and his guilt began to grow and grow. By the time he put on his pajamas the next night, his guilt and fear were larger than anything else in his life. He resolved to admit the truth to his parents.
The punishment would be steep, but it was worth it to have a clear conscience. He squirmed in his bed as he waited for his parents to tuck him in. My son knew the scary part was coming up. In spite of his tough talk, he leaned forward wide-eyed. I spoke quietly and deliberately. He heard all the noises of the house. The washing machine bounced around in the laundry room. Branches scraped against the brick outside his room. His baby brother cooed in the nursery. And there were some other noises he couldn't quite pinpoint. Finally, his dad's footsteps echoed down the hall.
Hey, Dad?
He called out nervously.
I've got something to tell you.
His dad stuck his head in the doorway at a weird angle. In the darkness, his mouth didn't seem to move, and the eyes were all wrong.
Yes, son?
The voice was way off, too.
Are you okay, Dad?
The boy asked.
Uh-huh,
sung the father in his strangely affected voice. Colby pulled the covers up defensively.
Is Mom around?
here I am.
Mom's head popped into the doorway below Dad's. Her voice was an unnatural falsetto.
Were you about to tell us that you gave your home address to Helper 23? You shouldn't have done that. We told you never to give out personal information on the internet.
She continued.
He wasn't really a kid. He just pretended to be one. Do you know what he did? He came to our house, broke in, and murdered both of us. Just so he could spend some time with you.
A fat man in a wet jacket emerged in the child's doorway, holding the two severed heads. Colby shrieked and gasped as the man dropped the heads on the ground, unsheathed his knife, and moved into the room to work on the boy. My son screamed too. He twisted his hands defensively over his face. But we were just getting started with the story. After several hours, the boy was almost dead, and his screams had become whimpers. The killer noticed the wailing of a baby in another room and removed his knife from Colby. This was a special treat. He had never murdered a baby before and was excited about the prospect. Helper 23 left Colby to die and followed the cries through the house like a homing beacon. In the nursery, he walked to the crib, picked the baby up, and held it in his arms. He moved towards the changing table to get a better look. But as he held the baby, The crying died down. The baby looked up and smiled. Helper 2-3 had never held a baby, but he gently bounced it in his arms like a pro. He wiped his bloody hands on the blanket so he could stroke the baby's cheek.
Hey there, sweet little guy.
The beautiful rage of sadism melted into something warmer and softer. He walked out of the nursery, took the baby home, named him William, and raised him as his very own. After I finished the story, my son was visibly shaken. Between ragged, staccato breaths, he stammered.
But Dad, my name's William.
I gave him a classic dad wink and tousled his hair.
Of course it is, son.
William ran up the stairs to his bedroom in a fury of sobs. But deep down,
I think he liked the story.
Nola. Written by Anton Scheller. Performed by Jordan Lester. Stein scrambled out of his room into the living room, and then behind the couch that I was sitting on. I noticed he had something in his hand when he came in, but he's 5 now, and I thought it wouldn't be anything dangerous. I heard him playing and laughing behind me while some soap opera played on. "Don't move," he said. That made me curious. I just wanted to see what he was playing with. I leaned over the back of the sofa, and he was sitting there with something white in his hand. It took me a moment to understand what was in front of him on the carpet. There were the bones of a complete human leg, and that he was just putting the last toe in place.
Get away from that!
I don't remember what I screamed, but I grabbed his arm and pulled him away. The police came soon after, and they searched his room. They had an expert come in, and he said that it was real bone, likely from a child. Later, they brought a search dog. Stein didn't want to say where he found the bones. I promised sweets. I promised a trip to the zoo. The officers even offered him a ride-along in a real police car and that he could use the siren. When my husband came home, he threatened that Stein couldn't get any more sweets until he would tell. That wasn't any more effective. It just made him cry. Every time we asked, Stein kept saying that he couldn't tell. And whenever we asked why he couldn't tell, he just pressed his lips together and shook his head. I was sure that he had come from his room. The police took his room apart, then the rest of the apartment. Even the dog found nothing. Stein cried a lot that evening, even after the police left. He said he didn't understand why everyone was so mean to him, and why the police were hurting his furniture, that he was just helping Nola. I'm not sure if he didn't want to say who Nola was, or if he himself really didn't know. The police said we could stay, but that we should probably keep Stein with us and not allow him to enter his room. Not as if I would have done that. Stein was between us, cuddled up against me with his father's arm on top of both of us. George and Stein were both fast asleep, but I remember staring at them for hours. It felt like a waking nightmare, but at some point I must have drifted off. George's shouting woke me up. George shouting, and then Stein crying. When I sat up, Stein was just pressing his body against the bedroom wall near the foot of our bed. George pulled Stein away. "Where did you get those?" George screamed. The panic in George's face was even greater than the panic in Stein's face. The door was open. We had definitely locked it. And on the floor, right between our bed and the wall, were another leg and a hip bone and the lower vertebra of a spine. George shouted at me to watch Stein and call the police. He threw Stein into my arms and he ran into the living room. I saw him check the front door. Then he returned and ran into Stein's room. Stein cried next to me. I just looked at the bones on the floor. They were so perfectly arranged, the way you would see a skeleton in a museum. It took a while before I managed to finally grab my mobile, pull Stein close, and dial the number. George found the front door and all the windows locked. He even checked whether somebody might have gotten in through the former fireplace. But he found Stein's room open. We had definitely locked that too. Open, just like the bedroom door, but not broken into. Just unlocked. The only key we have for those doors, the one that fits all the internal doors, was still in George's nightstand. George said he woke up because Stein was giggling and talking to himself. So he got up, walked around the bed, and there he was, arranging the bones. Stein is usually happy and very open to friendly adults, but he was scared of the police. He didn't want to be in the same room as the officers. They organized a child psychologist, a young woman dressed in normal clothes. She offered Stein sweets and a book. She was very nice to him, but the whole time she was there, Stein just tried to hide behind my legs and screamed whenever she got too close. We wanted to go to a hotel, but the upstairs neighbors were awake and took us in for the night. When the police finally left us alone and the neighbors had retreated to their bedroom, Stein spoke again. He said that the police are bad people, that they hurt Nola very much and stole her leg. Still, when we asked questions about Nola or the bones, he just shook his head. Stein fell asleep on the neighbor's armchair. We decided that at least one of us should keep watch for the remainder of the night. I told George to nap first. He always gets grim and grumpy when he's tired. Then I couldn't get myself to wake him, and I just stayed awake until morning. For those 3 hours, I sat and watched Stein. There was nothing specific to watch, just his calm breathing and the occasional smile that hushed over his lips, until he turned so that I couldn't see his face. Despite all the commotion, I felt warm and relaxed seeing him like that. At 7, the neighbors got up. I heard their alarm, a muffled conversation, then they disappeared in the bathroom. At around 7:30, they came into the living room, and George too woke up. George went to the bathroom. The neighbors asked me whether we were hungry. I was numb from the tiredness and was craving more for coffee than food. I went to the kitchen to help. It cannot have been more than 5 minutes. I walked back into the living room with the plates in my hand. I saw the empty armchair and looked around the room. I called for Stein, and nearly in the same moment I saw the open front door. The plates nearly fell on the table. Our apartment door was open. I heard Stein speaking to someone. Then I made the turn, and he sat there on the living room floor with a heap of bones. I grabbed his arms to pull him away, but he screamed and fought back, and when I kept pulling, he bit my arm. I screamed and pulled back, and within a fraction of a second, he had turned back to the bones, to arranging them. He was so incredibly quick. He just picked a bone from the heap, and within a moment, it was on the floor, in the right place, and another bone in his hand. not 10 seconds, and he had nearly arranged a whole hand. Then I finally managed to pull him away, even as he was screaming and trying to wiggle free or bite. George came running in, grabbed Stein from my hands, and carried him out of the room. Stein was still screaming and howling out in the corridor, and on the floor right in front of me, next to the heap and already arranged, were vertebra, ribs, and a few bones from both arms, and a nearly completed hand. I think, if not for the neighbor's testimony, the police wouldn't have believed us a single word. The officers searched our place a third time, even with a new dog, and again they found nothing. At least a dozen officers were going in and out of the apartment, but this time Stein didn't want to hide. Instead, he wanted to pat the dog. He was with us on the corridor, running his hands through the dog's fur, while we were talking to an officer about how to proceed. I looked at the officer's face. A moment later, I turned back around, and Stein was gone. There were a lot of people searching him and shouting his name. The dog was running wild through the apartment. I was pure, shivering panic, running in and out of Stein's room. I was in the living room. It was just a flash, a moment between all the noise, that I heard his voice. His giggling. I screamed, "Quiet!" and everybody stopped in their tracks. Even the dog obeyed. And there he was again, giggling. Then he spoke. His voice was faint, as if from far away.
"Don't worry, Nola. They won't find us here."
Within a few minutes, they had ripped open the fireplace, only to find nothing. George was holding me, but seeing the bare pipe and stones down there made my chest clench together. George stopped breathing, too. Then there he was again, giggling, louder than before. I called his name.
"Oh no,"
he whispered.
"Mom found us."
The dog's head twitched. In that moment, I knew. I told them to break through the floor, right in front of the chimney. Within a few minutes, they broke through a layer of wood and stone, right into an empty space, a tight tunnel. After that, we heard him coughing. I called him again.
"I'm not finished playing,"
he said. George told him that he would have to come out, that we were waiting for him. And a minute later, he came crawling through the tunnel. He was carrying a skull that he carefully set down. We hugged him. After a few moments, he shook himself free. Then he went to pet the dog. They didn't find much else down there. The tunnel ended abruptly at the end of the house, and at the end were a few more small bones from the same body and some of Stein's toys. We still don't know how he got down there. He always just said that Nola let him in. My husband thinks that's crazy, that there must have been a hidden entrance somewhere. But I know Stein isn't lying. Because the others didn't hear when Stein whispered, "Oh no, Mom found us." And a girl's voice replied,
"Don't worry. They never look down here."
Boothworld Industries. Written by Christopher Bloodworth. Narrated by Todd Farrell. Featuring Rebecca Peason. I'm sure that all of you are used to the cry for help type stories by now. Help me, blah, blah, blah. I won't bore you with another. Even if I wanted your help, you couldn't give it to me, because your help is useless. Why? because you're not a member. I just wish I wasn't either. It all started innocently enough, with a phone call. I'd been up for a few hours, unpacking and cleaning, waiting for the plumber to call. I just moved into a cabin, and the contractors fucked everything up. Because of that, I now have the wonderful task of making calls to competent people that can fix what the original contractors did wrong. The phone rang at 12:06. Not bad, I thought. Usually plumbers don't bother to call or show up until 5. When I picked up the phone, I didn't even get a chance to say hello before a woman on the other line told me to
please hold for the next available operator.
I hopped up and sat on the cabinet in the kitchen. It was one of the few places in the cabin not occupied with boxes. Elevator music leaked into my ear. I'd started to drowse off when the music stopped and a piano chord that sounded like it was 3 notes that didn't quite go together played through the receiver twice. A voice came on the line.
Welcome to Boothworld Industries. My name is Samantha and I will be your operator today. Name?
I didn't know what to say, so I told the operator my name.
Sir, we know who you are. I'm your operator. Please give me a name to access.
I don't understand, I said.
It can be anyone, sir. We just need a name.
Okay, I said. I made up a name. Harold Withers.
Sir, as your operator, I must point out that fictitious names or the names of people that you don't know cannot be used.
Used for what? I asked. How had she known that I'd made up that name? The whole thing felt like it was some sort of prank, but hardly anybody knew my new phone number.
Remodeling.
Remodeling? Is this the plumber? I asked.
Welcome to Boothworld Industries. My name is Samantha, and I will be your operator today. Name?
I took that as a yes and gave them the name of an old ex-girlfriend. Jessica Goodwin. I could hear the clicking of a keyboard on the other end of the phone. It sounded like the woman was pounding the thing with her fists. After a few moments of this, she returned.
Jessica Goodwin,
she said.
Remodeling is scheduled for August 21st, 2015. Would you like to reschedule?
I was silent on my side of the phone. I couldn't believe this. Someone had to be playing a prank on me. Who is this? Is this you, Jessica? Are you playing a prank on me? I asked. The woman didn't respond for a long time. I thought that whoever was on the other end of the phone was holding in a laugh. Hello? I asked.
Yes or no, sir?
The woman asked back. Yes, I said, not understanding what the woman was asking.
I have a Tuesday appointment available. Will that work?
At this point, I thought I was going insane and that it actually was the plumbing company. What about today? I asked. Do you have anything available for today?
Normally, we can't arrange for a reschedule on such short notice, but today we had a cancellation. How does 3 o'clock work for you?
3 o'clock is fine, I said.
3 o'clock it is then. Would you like a courtesy call?
Sure.
Wonderful. We at Boothworld Industries say thanks and welcome to the club. You have a marvelous day.
That strange chord played twice again, and the line went dead. I rolled my eyes and went back to unpacking. My phone rang at 3 o'clock on the dot that afternoon. Hello? I said.
Sir, this is Samantha with Boothworld Industries again. Your courtesy call begins now.
What do you... I began to say, but was cut off by those diminished chords blaring into my ear. Then I heard Jessica's voice.
Why are you doing this?
Jessica asked. I could hear the tears in her voice. Jessica? I asked.
Sir, she cannot hear you. This is a courtesy call. The appointment has already concluded. Please.
Jessica begged.
Please don't do this. I'll do anything you want.
Jessica's voice choked off into a wheeze, and all I could hear on the other end of the phone was the rustling of clothing. More wheezing. Eventually it stopped, and someone picked up on the other end. man's voice said.
We at Boothworld Industries say thanks and welcome to the club. You have a marvelous day.
Sir?
The operator came back on the line.
Was that to your satisfaction?
I sat there for a long time, cold sweat dripping down my rib cage. Jessica was my ex because I walked in on her and my best friend fucking at a party in high school. I smiled and whispered, "That was perfect."
Wonderful,
the operator said.
We at Boothworld Industries aim to serve. Would you like to make another appointment?
As I stared at the water leaking from the door of the dishwasher, I smiled even bigger. "Yes," I said. "Yes, I would."
Name?
Dan. I don't have a last name. He's a contractor.
Dan Arancibia, July 13th, 2032. Would you like to reschedule?
"Yes," I said.
How would Wednesday work for you?
"Didn't you say you had a Tuesday appointment available?" I asked.
I did, but unfortunately that slot has been filled by another member. Would Wednesday work for you?
"No," I said. "I have a job interview that day. What about Thursday?"
Unfortunately, Thursday will not work. You are due for remodeling Wednesday night.
"What?" I asked. She repeated the exact same thing to me again.
Unfortunately, Thursday will not work. You are due for remodeling Wednesday night.
"Can we reschedule my remodeling?" I asked.
Of course we can, sir.
The woman said. It sounded like she was smiling on the other end of the phone.
There's always a way.
I waited for her to tell me how. She didn't speak. "How?" I asked.
Boothworld Industries is always looking to add new members. We are, of course, a membership by invitation only club. Sadly, our membership numbers have fallen in recent years. Economic recessions, wars, politics. What we would like you to do in order to avoid your own remodeling appointment is help us add several new members.
The light at the end of the tunnel, I thought. "How many members do you need?" I asked.
1,000.
I choked. 1,000?
Yes, sir. Otherwise, we'll have to keep our scheduled appointment. We must inform you that the member that scheduled this appointment did request a courtesy call.
Everything stopped at that point for me. All my life I'd just skated by, not doing anything, not making a difference. My mouth actually dried up. I'd always thought that was just a thing people wrote in books to be dramatic. It's not. "I'll get you your 1,000 members," I whispered.
We at Boothworld Industries say thanks and welcome to the club. You have a marvelous day.
The connection ended. I hung up the phone and stared at it for a long time. I'm scheduled for remodeling on Wednesday, and somewhere, someone will be getting a courtesy call to listen to my last few breaths if I don't get 1,000 members to join Boothworld Industries. It's funny. I'd always wanted to join an elite club. Skull and Bones, New World Order. I'm not sure how I got in, but now I'm a member. I've got until Wednesday to enjoy it. Like I said at the beginning, even if I wanted your help, you couldn't give it to me because you're not a member. Membership is by invitation only. I'm inviting you in. You can help me. Just call 630-296-7536.
What Hurricane Sandy Uncovered. Written by Victor King. Performed by Jason Hill. It was 2012 when Hurricane Sandy hit the northeast United States. New York City was fixated on a dangling crane in Midtown Manhattan. Elsewhere on the coast, weird stories and photos circulated the internet and social media. Most notably, a picture of a shark on the flooded front lawn of a New Jersey home. One of the more disturbing pictures I saw was that of a casket floating down an empty street. I've searched high and low for a copy of that photo, just to prove my story really, but I haven't found it since. Caskets floating away during a flood aren't a new thing, believe it or not. In New Orleans, the problem of airtight coffins popping out of the ground because of heavy rainfall became so bad, well, most graves are now either lined with concrete or they just build them above ground. Before Sandy, this phenomenon was unheard of in the state of Connecticut. I never saw it personally, mind you. I just saw the picture I mentioned in a few stories from patrons at the bar I used to work at. Problem with that is, drunks aren't exactly known for their honest storytelling, of course. But this story, the story I'm telling you, this story took place the day after the hurricane. The bar I work at is located on the outskirts of Waterbury, Connecticut. My boss called me and asked me if I could go check out the place and make sure it hadn't been damaged or looted. I said I would on the condition that I could drink for free when I got there. He agreed, not having much choice in being flooded in and all, and I was in my truck and on my way, figuring I'd spend my afternoon relaxing in an empty bar. There's something inherently creepy about a city the day after a storm. Major roadways are abandoned. Streetlights are out. One major intersection I had to go through simply had a stop sign stuck in a Home Depot bucket in the middle of the road instead of the usual working stoplights. The power was out, so most of the houses I passed were pitch black. Pure silence hung over everything, with the exception of my truck's engine and the country station I was listening to. Only one word came to mind at that moment. Apocalyptic. I pulled into the strip mall where the bar was located. I locked up and moved towards the glass front door. The neon sign outside had been broken in the storm. McKinley's Gin Mill was written in hunter green Gothic type on yellowing plastic. The break in the sign was in the top left corner where an Irish caricature grinned over a mug of beer. With the top left part of his head missing, a single remaining eye made his smile seem more sinister than sarcastic. I opened up and I flipped the switch. The lights stayed off. Power's out, signs broken, but I couldn't see any other damage. I grabbed a green Jameson bottle along with my portable iPod player, kept under the bar, and made my way into the adjoining room. The way McKinley's was set up was as soon as you walked through the front door, you're in the bar room. The room had wood paneling and was decorated with photos, posters, signs, scattered on the walls. Across from the bar was a 5-foot gap in the wall that led to an area with a big screen TV, pool table, and a jukebox. I put the bottle on one of the tables and set up my iPod. I enjoy solitude for the most part, and the idea of drinking a bottle of Irish and listening to music while casually improving my pool game was welcome compared to how I usually spend my nights. Noisy 20-somethings taking Instagram pics and comparing how drunk they are. Well, I just put my chill-out playlist on and set up the table. I was maybe halfway through my second game when I heard the bell over the front door tingle. I put down the pool cue to the sound of a scraping stool. I walked back into the barroom and saw the man's back. "You got a drink there, friend?" he asked in a sing-song voice. I made my way to the shelf with all the liquor bottles. The man was dressed odd compared to our usual clientele. He was wearing a dark black suit, like the guy had just gotten out of church or something. "What's your poison?" I asked. He rapped his knuckles on the wood. "Four Roses bourbon, if you'd be so kind. 3 fingers neat, if you don't mind." I reached up to the top of the shelf and grabbed the dust-covered bottle. I took clean rocks glass from the bottom of the shelf before turning towards the man and pouring the drink. The man grabbed the glass and I looked up at him. That was the first time I got a real look at him. His suit wasn't Sunday best, as I had originally thought. Patches of it had rotted away. It was covered in patches of mud and dirt and pus-yellow stains that shone past the black. The shirt underneath, which had once been white, was now a light brown, and the same sickly yellow blotches scattered about. But that wasn't the horrifying part. His eyes were glazed over white, with only evidence of pupils being putrid milk-colored dots. His skin was pulled tight against his skull like pale cling film. The right side of his face didn't even have that much. The bottom of his right eyeball was visible past a half-rotten eyelid. Cheekbone, jaw, teeth were all visible in a deep yellow color. He sipped the whiskey, and brown liquor ran through the gaps in his teeth. "It burns. Very fine, friend. Very fine. Damn good stuff," he said with a half grin. I pulled back and the man gave a deep laugh. "Oh, I know. I must look a mess. Caught me reflection in the store window. Don't you worry, don't mean you any kind of harm. Not to you, at least." I reached under the bar, my hand wrapped around a sawn-off baseball bat we kept in case of a robbery. "If you're aiming to use that bat, you'd better make sure your first hit is true, friend. I don't want to hurt you, but I will." How did he know what I was thinking? Did he check under the bar when he walked in? Did he see the reflection in the mirror? But he answered for me. "It's when you're dead, gone on 60 years, you start to see things no one else does," he said, pointing at his half-exposed eye. "The eye sees all, I'm afraid. I see your heart racing. I see your knuckles whitening on that bat. I see you, Frank." My fingers tightened around the leather grip. He took another sip. "I don't know how I know either, but please, friend, put the bat down. I just got out and I'd just like a bit of friendly conversation. Grab a drink, pal. My dime." I let go of the bat and tried to feel the shelf behind me. I half swung my hand around until I felt fingers touch glass. I put another rocks glass on the bar top in front of me, not wanting to lose sight of the stranger. When a man with half a face, who knows your first name, asks to have a drink with you, you have 3 choices. Option A, try to kill him. Well, that wasn't a choice if he knew what I was thinking before I thought it. Option B is to scream and run. But run where? The police? "Oh, I'm sorry, officer, but can I trouble you to take care of this zombie in my bar?" "Oh, yes, I've been drinking. Why do you ask?" Option C. Have a drink. Hope for the best. I poured myself a bourbon, trying to avoid staring at his face. "Oh, you go ahead and look," the man said. Before you ask, I don't know I am here. Well, not here. I'm here to have a drink and some conversation. Here, though, there's a mystery. I woke up staring at silk. Clawed at it, I did. Screamed I did, and I don't know for how long. Could have been a day, could have been 60 years. Didn't exactly have a calendar down there. All I know is the box housing started to move. The wood was old enough that after a few hits I cracked it, ripped apart the top of me coffin and made me way up here. You can imagine it's been quite an interesting day for me, friend. He chuckled. I drank deep and poured myself another. By the by, is East Windsor Road still 3 blocks down? He asked. No, 3 blocks down is, Kennedy Street, I responded. He looked confused. Kennedy Street, eh? And who's Kennedy? I'm talking 3 blocks that way, he said while pointing behind himself with his thumb. Yeah, that's Kennedy Street. And that's Kennedy, I said while nodding towards a black and white photo of JFK we had hung on the wall by the mirror. Kennedy, eh? And, what did he do to earn a place in that fine wall? I responded to the 60-year-old dead man the same way I would a drunk patron. He was the first Irish Catholic president. The man laughed. Irish Catholic president. Irish Catholic. Oh, by God. I would have loved to have seen that. Oh, what is? First woman president. The first black president. The first atheist. I stared at him a moment. I hope he's not a racist. Oh, we have a black president now. President Barack Obama. He laughed so hard he almost fell out of his chair. Oh my God, friend. Oh, that's rich. A black man as a president. What a time. Oh, God. I've missed so much. He wrapped his fingers in the bar. Tell me, Frank, do you believe in fate, my friend? I shook my head. Well, I do, he responded. At least, I do now. 60 years on the earth. Only me to keep me company. And I know why, too. My pretty wife. Well, I guess pretty ex-wife now. She killed me. He shook his head. I knew that stew tasted funny. Anyways, my wife wanted to be with my friend Teddy. And I knew at the time that they were running around together. One night I go home and eat a nice home-cooked meal. Next thing I know, I'm clawing at the ceiling. He finished his bourbon. Dark brown trails on yellowed bone through gritted teeth. I'll have my revenge, though. Seeing as I'm gonna walk down Kennedy Street. Go right up to my old house and knock on the door and yell, Honey, I'm home. And then when I see her face, well, she won't be so pretty anymore. And I do so hope Teddy'll be there too. Oh, That would be a proper homecoming. By God. He stood up. I'll pay you back, friend, when I get the chance. I seem to be a bit light at the moment. I'm sure you understand. Silancha. Frank. He turned around and walked out the door. As the bell above the door tingled, I fell to the ground, trembling. I had finally composed myself a few hours later in the mid-afternoon. I locked up, texted my boss about the damage, and went home. I didn't sleep much. I ended up calling out of work the next few days. But with a combination of sleep deprivation and just repeating to myself that it was a bad Halloween prank, I finally found the courage to go back. Then, a week after my return, I was opening up when I found an envelope shoved under the door. Inside was a newspaper clipping about an elderly couple who seems to have been ripped apart by some animal. Also, $9. Once I found out from the owner a glass of 4 roses cost $3 when they first opened in 1951. I quit, and I left the state of Connecticut for good.
Chilling tales for dark nights.